This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and today's interview is being recorded on the premises of the 2016 conference of the Association for Israel Studies here in Jerusalem. My guest today is a historian and international relations professor at Tel Aviv University. He is the author of the forthcoming book Margaret Thatcher and the Middle East, to be published in English by Cambridge University Press, and it seeks to examine a specific aspect of the foreign policy of Britain's longest-serving Prime Minister, especially in relation to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Dr. Azriel Bermant, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Good morning, pleasure to be here.
So, when it comes to foreign policy, Thatcher is probably best remembered for launching the Falklands War and her position on European integration and the Soviet Union. Did she really have a remarkable stance on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at all?
Well, this is the fascinating thing, is there's so little has been written about Margaret Thatcher and her policy on the Middle East and specifically the Arab-Israel conflict. She's known, for example, for her strong stance on policy towards the Soviet Union, the Cold War thinking, her skepticism on Europe, Falklands War you mentioned, of course, and also even on South Africa. For example, sanctions. She was known for her deep skepticism over sanctions towards South Africa. But on Israel and Palestinians, not that much has been written.
Was she preoccupied with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
She did deal with it a lot, and there were certain points in her career when it was actually a major issue. But the interesting thing is that she was Prime Minister. She was an MP of a constituency, Finchley, which had one of the largest Jewish populations. So there was pressure on her to take a supportive policy on Israel. So that of itself is an interesting thing.
But one thing also that's very well known about Thatcher is that she'll take orders from no one. So that pressure, how influential was it really in shaping her opinions on Israel-Palestine?
That's one of the issues I discuss in my book. To what extent was, for example, conservative Friends of Israel, to what extent was the pro-Israel lobby a factor? And I say, although there was strong attempts to influence her, for the most part, she was strong-minded. There were only certain points where you could argue that she was affected. For example, during the Lebanon War, where there was a lot of pressure on her to just try and stem the Foreign Office's line on Israel, their strong criticisms. And there was a point where she did eventually, some evidence that she did intervene, but on the whole, she stayed fairly clear of that pressure.
Did her premiership with regard to Israel-Palestine, but also on other issues of foreign policy, mark a turning point in Britain's foreign policy, in its attitude towards Israel? Was it really significant?
So, the interesting thing is, not that long after Thatcher came to power, you had the EEC, now today it's the EU, then it was the European Economic Community, came along with the Venice Declaration, June 1980, this exactly 36 years ago, a landmark declaration of European policy towards Israel and the Palestinians. For the first time, you had an open communique calling for Palestinian self-determination and for the Palestinian Liberation Organization, in those days a terrorist organization, according to Israel, according to the United States. And here you had the EEC calling for the Palestinians to be part of the negotiations process. You had a condemnation of settlement building in the West Bank. You also, of course, had Israel's security had to be recognized. But for the first time, you had a strong call by the Europeans for a new position on Israel and Palestinians. This was a shift. This was a major shift.
Did she play any part in
Margaret Thatcher, who was initially very, very sceptical about the idea of Palestinian self-determination, she was concerned that there wouldn't be the Palestinian state wouldn't be viable. Her foreign minister, her foreign secretary at the time, Lord Carrington, he was effectively the architect of the Venice Declaration. He believed very strongly in Palestinian self-determination. He pushed it hard. Thatcher was resistant to it, and she eventually caved in. and went along with it. And once she endorsed it, she was very protective of it, very supportive of it. She said, "We have to. This is something that we have to do."
But when she came into office, was she more pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli? If that's even a question you can answer.
Well, interesting question, because in the mid-70s, when she was the leader of the opposition, before she became Prime Minister, she was the leader of the Conservative Party. And there were concerns in the Foreign Office. There was one cable, for example, from a British diplomat in Jordan who said, we're worried about Thatcher's membership of the Conservative Friends of Israel. We're worried about the Friendship League of Israel. She was concerned that her pro-Israel links would be seen as a problem in the Arab world. And they said, we're worried that Margaret Thatcher would be a prisoner of the Zionists.
Right.
That was the term he used.
Because the Foreign Office was more leaning towards the normalised relations with the Arab world.
So there were concerns, certainly within Whitehall, that she would be seen as too pro-Israel.
Right. And was she, eventually?
Well,
I mean, in retrospect?
First of all, she admired Israel for its democracy. That's a central thing. She admired Israel's democratic traditions. You also have to remember she was a very strong admirer of the Jewish community, self-reliance. She saw Israel as an oasis of democracy in the Middle East. And there was even the Christian beliefs which affected her. And so she definitely came to power as a pro-Israeli politician.
And also she was very well known for her positions on terror. And given that the PLO at the time was recognized across the board as a terrorist organization, that didn't help foster any sympathies for the Palestinians.
Thatcher's position on terrorism is one of the central themes in my book, because Thatcher was known for a strong stand on terrorism. It was one of her trademark positions, and with Reagan, she was very supportive of Reagan. For example, his bombing of Libya in 1986. And when Thatcher became the first British Prime Minister to visit Israel in 1986, they loved her because of a strong stand against terrorism. But yet, under her leadership, for example, Britain was talking to Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe, who had been involved in terrorism, and she allowed the PLO to have an office in London. And in fact, in 1982, British, not the Foreign Secretary, but the Foreign Office Minister held talks with PLO, Douglas Hurd. This was definitely a shift. So there were a very gradual rise in talks, dialogue between Britain and the PLO. In spite of Thatcher's own hostility, Thatcher would not meet with Arafat. She refused to meet with Arafat.
Was any of this influenced by her admiration for the United States and specifically President Reagan and his Israel policy?
Well, you have an interesting paradox of a leader who was very pro-American, but her pro-American stance didn't necessarily mean that she was always going to take Israel's position. She was hostile to Menachem Begin, she was hostile to Yitzhak Shamir. She felt that their policies were creating difficulties for the West, because she was worried that as long as there was no attempt to resolve the Israel-Palestinian conflict, the Soviet Union, you have to remember her hostility to the Soviet Union, her Cold War perspective had a major impact on policy towards the Middle East. She was worried that the Soviets were strengthening their influence in the Arab world because they were posing as the champions of the Palestinian cause.
Right.
So this was letting the Soviets in.
Oh, so it would up the credentials of the Soviet Union because the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is still in process. Right.
And she was very unhappy with Reagan because he wasn't doing anything to help those moderate forces. Who were the moderate forces? They were Shimon Peres, King Hussein, President Mubarak, if you like, in Egypt, and also, in her view, the Saudis.
Was that a backdrop to her Israel visit in 1986?
So she came to Israel because she wanted to help Shimon Peres, who was Prime Minister at the time. Of course, there was a national unity coalition. Peres was Prime Minister in 86, in the first half of 1986. Shamir was the Foreign Minister. And she was subtly trying to help Peres at the expense, if you like, of Yitzhak Shamir.
How so?
So her visit to Israel was an example of that. She wouldn't have come if Shamir had been Prime Minister.
Right. It was also a landmark visit, the first ever of a British Prime Minister.
Sure. And she did everything she could to try and help Peres.
Looking back on her premiership, 11 years, that's a long time.
Yeah.
Would you say that it really marked a radical change with respect to her predecessors, both Labour and Conservative, and also Conservative leaders, the same way that her premiership did in so many other respects?
There were important changes, but at the beginning, again, another paradox. Thatcher's first years in power, 1979 to 82, were disastrous for Anglo-Israel relations. Simply because, first of all, the Venice Declaration. Begin was furious. The Begin government was furious with Britain's role in the Venice Declaration, in the whole idea to recognise Palestinian self-determination. And this led to a great hostility, particularly between Begin and Lord Carrington, who was Foreign Secretary.
Yeah.
And then there was another issue, which was Israel's bombing of the Iraqi nuclear reactor in 1981.
Yeah.
Which Thatcher condemned. She was furious with Israel for doing this. She felt there was no evidence that Iraq was building a nuclear weapon. And she, if anything, she went further than the Foreign Office on this. And then in 1982, you had Israel's invasion of Lebanon, which you have to remember, Britain was not just fighting the Falklands War against the Argentinians. There were also allegations that Israel was selling arms to the Argentinians. So all of this was happening in 1982. So just, one thing after another caused major problems. So,
Did she come out against Israel's invasion of Lebanon? Did it also infuriate her?
Well, this is the thing. Britain saw that Israel's invasion of Lebanon from their perspective of the Falklands, that Argentina had invaded their territory. Now Israel was invading Lebanese territory.
Right.
Israel said, how can you say, this is double standards? We're defending ourselves from rockets. And Britain goes all the way to the Falkland Islands, a faraway island. However, things turned around after the 1983 election. After Thatcher's re-election, there was an effort to try and improve the dialogue between Britain and Israel.
By whom?
By Thatcher, but also by the Foreign Office, to try and improve things. There was a dialogue. There was a new Foreign Secretary, Geoffrey Howe. And then, of course, in 1986, you had Thatcher's visit to Israel. Although, before that, in 1985, you had the effort by Britain to try and play a role to get a peace process going. And this included Britain hosting 2 PLO officials in London in October 1985. It's caused, again, a major problem with Israel.
Yeah.
But, of course, the whole thing fell through because the 2 PLO officials refused, one of the PLO officials refused to denounce terrorism. The whole thing fell through. And this was a fiasco for Thatcher.
So, if I understand what you're saying here, there wasn't a significant break from the historical or traditional British attitude towards Israel and Palestine. There was just more of it.
Yes, but I think you also have to remember that Begin, yes, he achieved the Camp David Accords in 1979, but he had a very hard-line position, which sooner or later would have led to problems, in my view. And then you had the issue of the Peres-Shamir coalition government, where there was an opportunity for Britain to try and strengthen Peres, in their view.
Yeah.
And Thatcher and the Foreign Office had a shared view on this. We need to strengthen the moderates. And one of the roles that Thatcher played, which is not known, was she supported the 1987 secret meeting between King Hussein and Shimon Peres in London, which led to the London Agreement. Here you had a landmark, groundbreaking agreement between Israel and Jordan on a way to leading possibly to an international conference where there was a potential, I use the word potential, for a possible agreement which could help resolve the conflict. And it fell through largely because the Americans didn't want to get involved.
Right.
Now this could have changed everything. This was before Hamas, for example, was really building influence on the ground. Instead, it fell through, and what you had instead was the Palestinian Intifada.
Yeah. Another remarkable thing about Thatcher is that she is the first Conservative Prime Minister who had a significant number of Jews in her cabinet. Yeah. Did this play any role in swaying her policy on Israel? Not just her constituency, Jewish heavy constituency of Finchley, but also her close associates?
Well, I think that those Jews who were in a cabinet were not so much involved with foreign policy. One exception perhaps is Malcolm Rifkind, who was a Foreign Office Minister, but he dealt less with Israel and more with the Soviet Union and such issues. So I think that it helped her, possibly in the Jewish community. They looked on her because of the fact that she was so well disposed towards the Jewish community, and the fact that she appointed all these. So it helped her I don't think it made any difference really to the policy on Israel and the Palestinians.
All right, Dr. Azriel Bermant, thank you very much. I'm afraid this is all we have time for, so we'll have to leave it there. You're a historian and international relations scholar at Tel Aviv University and the author of the forthcoming book, Margaret Thatcher and the Middle East. Thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And also big thanks to Alex Benish, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick.
מצאו תקופה לשבור לך את הלב, העולם כאילו כלום מסתובב, מה אני אגיד לך? בוא נראה. לא, אין לי קלישאות לזרוק בכל מקרה. אם זה כואב, אז זה כואב. אני פה, אם תרצה ככה לשתות, לשפוך את הלב. קשה לראות אותך דועך, וגם שמע, אולי מוקדם להתלכלך, הרי אולי עוד תחזרו, אולי תהיה עוד חתונה.